Good morning, guys. Sorry that we have to do class via this kind of real informal way of lecture today, but I want to make sure that we have the critical information you're going to need for your exam, and hopefully you're enjoying a snow day, kind of watching the snow from your house and not too trapped wherever you live. The information that I'm going to cover today will be on your exam, so make sure you are taking notes, but really want to encourage you to pull up the PowerPoint on the Roman Empire. It's available on Joule. Also, many of you might not realize, maybe you didn't look on Joule far enough down, but the study guide for Exam 1 is already posted. So that might be a helpful thing to print out or at least pull up on your computer and start kind of filling in answers as I lecture. So today, we're going to deal with the Roman Empire. And as we've been talking about this great contrast between the Roman Empire and the Kingdom of God, this peaceful kingdom that embraces the poor, the needy, elevates women, reverses the notions of disability, and the Roman Empire that wins land by domination and threat and authority and performs crucifixion, as opposed to the Kingdom of God, which celebrates resurrection. So today, we're going to look at the notion of empire, Roman law, the role of the emperor, the might of the army, world domination, and the patron-client status and civic religion. So, need to give you some history. So let's think back about 300 years before Jesus' life. Around the year 323, there was a young Greek leader. His name was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was trained by some of the best philosophers in Greek philosophy, and Alexander had one passion in his life, is to conquer the world. And Alexander believed in something called Hellenization. Hellenization. This is something you want to write down, make sure you get on your notes. Hellenization is the notion of the pushing or enforcing of Greek culture and Greek language, Greek thinking, Greek way of life on all persons. So, today America has a way to do this too. We like to push our American products, our American freedoms, even our notion of government. We kind of push that around the world. And the Greeks, especially Alexander the Great, was really into this. And we're going to see a great tension in Judaism before Jesus' life when it comes to the Hellenized world and how the Jews deal with the Hellenized culture. The Jews practiced circumcision, practiced Sabbath, had very strict dietary laws. Even their names were very connected to the Jewish Hebrew Bible. And Hellenization pushes against that. Hellenization had this idea of gymnasiums and naked sports and a whole different way of thinking about it. So Alexander the Great will conquer a lot of the world, and then he will suddenly die. And this is about, like I said, about 300 years before Jesus, and his great domination was splintered. It actually turns into about 4 mini empires, and this carries on until about the year 150 or so. And during this time, there was great tension between the Jewish leadership and the average Jew of Israel and these, what they would deem, pagan Greek persons. And this really comes to the head in the year 165, where a Greek leader named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, right? Imagine that for your baby's name. But anyways, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he believed he was a godlike figure. And he'd gotten himself in trouble in another conflict, got whipped, owed some money, and when he came back to Israel, who he was beginning to plunder, he had built gymnasiums and he had all kinds of naked parties and learning centers. He attempted to plunder the temple. So this Jewish temple, which was the site of where they believed God's presence dwelt, the Holy of Holies, Antiochus Epiphanes IV goes into the temple seeking to take the money out of the temple. And he's a pagan. He cannot be in this temple. He then creates all these laws where he forbids circumcision. He outlaws Jewish sacrifice, and it would be illegal to read the Torah, the Old Testament. Even owning the Old Testament was against the law, and some of this stuff could be you could be killed for. So you have this radical Jewish nation now being outlawed from all their Jewish practices. So there's incredible tension, and it really comes to the apex when Antiochus Epiphanes IV enters the temple and he makes a sacrifice in the temple. So he's not Jewish, he's a pagan idolater. He attempts to set up an idol of the god Zeus in the temple, which is a complete, utter no-no in the Jewish religion. And then he sacrifices a pig on the altar. And if you know anything about Judaism or even Islam, a pig is an unclean or non-kosher animal. This would be, this would kind of like be the equivalent if you went into some local church and you just started urinating over everything. It would be an absolute utter disgrace, right? So this leads to a Jewish rebellion, and many Jews are killed, but a Jewish leader by the name of Judas the Maccabees, Judas the Hammer, he will lead guerrilla warfare, and he will defeat Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He will defeat the Greeks. He expels the Greek leadership, and this leads to a period of what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. You can read this whole story if you want in a letter or a book called First Maccabees. It's actually in the Bible that you have to purchase for class. If you're Roman Catholic, it's in your Bible already, because Roman Catholics believe this text to be a part of the Old Testament. If you're a part of the Protestant church, Baptist Pentecostals, you won't have it in your Bible, but we have it in there, and you can read this story. Well, either way, Judas the Maccabees wins the day. He ushers in the Hasmonean dynasty, and really from about 142 BCE to 60 BCE, this leads to kind of a golden age where the Jews are running their own nation. They're running things by Jewish law, and it's a great time to live in Israel because you're allowed to perform sacrifice and circumcision, and they're being led by God, what they believe to be God. So Judas Maccabees, he cleanses the temple, he reappoints a high priest, and things are going really, really well. This is a great time. So this Judas the Maccabees becomes a figure or a person who's living about 140 years before Jesus, but he becomes the hope of what people want when they think about a Messiah. So it's kind of like today when we think about presidents, so often people are trying to elect the next Abraham Lincoln. So Jesus would be hopefully the next Judas the Maccabees. So what we know, what happens is around the year 60 BCE, so this is way after Judas the Maccabees now, in this Jewish heyday is beginning to wane. The Roman Empire is beginning to surround Israel, and they begin to move towards Israel. And we find out that Rome sets up a relationship with Israel, promising not to invade, but they want to begin to appoint leaders in Israel. And that's where a guy by the name of Herod the Great, his father is appointed high priest. And what we're going to find out is a lot of things is going on in the Roman Empire. By this time in the year 45 or 44 BCE, Julius Caesar is assassinated. There creates a huge civil war in the Roman Empire where two key figures you may have heard of, Mark Antony and his girlfriend Cleopatra, rival against a young guy named Octavian or Augustus. And this is a battle for the Roman Empire. We're going to find out that Augustus or Octavian, he'll win the day, and he becomes this bringer of peace. But at this point, the Romans then insert and put a leader in Israel who is both Jewish but loyal to Rome. So some Jews are happy, but most Jews are upset because they know this guy is loyal to Rome and he can't be totally loyal to his religion. And that guy is Herod the Great. It's a name you're going to want to know. You want to know Alexander the Great, you need to know Herod the Great. Now, in this time when Rome has this great civil war, Augustus or Octavian, he becomes the emperor. He's this young, talented, he was trained by Julius Caesar, and this guy, he'll be declared the Prince of Peace. Some people will call him the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings. Some people will say that when he was born, angels foretold his birth, and that when he was born, angels came across the sky, filled the sky with angelic good news. The good news of his birth, the gospel of his birth. Now, those type of things should sound really, really familiar. If you're familiar with the way the Gospel of Luke tells the story of Jesus, the way that Luke writes the story of Jesus in his birth mirrors the way that people in the Roman Empire were talking about Augustus or Octavian. So, one of the things I'm going to claim in this class is this great theme of political activity we're going to see in the New Testament, and how this New Testament is a political document that readers in the first century would automatically see. they would hear it and they say, "Ah, I know what you're doing there. This is a spin-off of the story of Octavian." And really the claim is then that Jesus of Nazareth is greater than Octavian. That Octavian, or the emperor, is not the bringer of peace, but it's Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth. He's the bringer of peace. So we're going to find out that this is all going on in Rome, right? This is great war and a new emperor. But in Israel, hundreds of miles and thousands of miles away, in Israel, this little Jewish nation, now Herod the Great has been named ruler. He has to fight a while, but he ultimately rules for 33 years. He was a Jew, but deeply loyal to Rome. And he wanted to Hellenize the nation. So what he first does is he begins to remodel the Jewish temple. Now, you've heard me talk about that a little bit, about the Jewish temple. We know that the first temple was back in the Old Testament. That was under King Solomon. If you're familiar with any of the Old Testament, you probably heard of a guy by the name of King David. Well, Solomon was his son. Solomon was this really wealthy, intelligent guy, had 1,000 wives. Solomon built this lavish, lush temple. And that survived for about 200 years, until a group of Babylonians came in and destroyed the temple. We know that 70 years later, after that, they begin to rebuild the temple. And it's in this second temple, or the second temple period, that Jesus of Nazareth will come about and be born, and he is familiar with the second temple, but it's a lesser temple. You know, it's like going from a brick mansion to a single wide. It's still important, it's still your house, it's still the house of God, but it's not as elaborate as it was. So when Herod the Great comes and rules Israel, he's kind of embarrassed, and he wants to gain loyalty from the people by making this temple super elaborate. So if you've ever seen the show Pimp My Ride, MTV used to do, Herod kind of pimps out the temple. And it's such a long project, a remodeling project that took over 30 years. The project actually outlasted Herod the Great. So, interesting thing is he gains loyalty, but the interesting thing about Herod is that he will be the leader of Israel when Jesus is born. But shortly after Jesus' birth, probably about 3 years after Jesus' birth, so when Jesus was 3 or 4 years old, we're going to find out Herod's going to die. But there's really a masterful parallel between kind of the carnage and the rage and tyranny of Herod as opposed to Jesus of Nazareth. So what I've showed you in this PowerPoint, you can see a picture of the temple, a picture of what we think that second temple would look like, and it would be a glorious thing. I mean, especially if you are from northern Israel, remote parts, you come to Jerusalem, and this would be like coming to the Taj Mahal, you know. And but about Herod, he's an important person. You'll need to know him. The first thing he does when he comes to power is he kills off all the people connected to the Hasmonean line. Now, the Hasmonean line are the group of people that were running Israel during that Jewish heyday. He kills them all off. And then he begins a major construction project. Not only of the temple, but he also builds an entirely new city that he calls Caesarea. And that's going to sound familiar to another word you're used to, which is Caesar. This dude, Herod the Great, builds an entire city and he dedicates it to the emperor. So, I mean, that's a pretty nice gift, right? I mean, your boyfriend will probably buy you flowers and candy for Valentine's Day, but Herod provides an entire city for the emperor. Herod goes on to marry 10 wives, but he's jealous and paranoid, so he kills some of his wives and some of his sons. Herod's also the monster who's responsible for a story in the Bible where Jesus is born, the wise men come in, Herod finds out that another king has been born, Herod sends out his troops, and he slaughters an entire village, but specifically targeting children 2 years and under. So imagine giving the orders to kill children, toddlers, 2 years and under. Herod was a monster. Another example of this was on his deathbed, Herod gave orders that all the important men of Israel should be gathered together at this large center, kind of like what we would think the Expo Center here is, and that as soon as he dies, those men should be surrounded and all slaughtered. Herod's reported to say, "If Israel will not grieve for me, I will give them a reason to grieve." So he's kind of a nut job. Even 5 days before his death, he kills one of his closest sons. This guy ruled Israel by anger and jealousy, domination and cruelty. A radical contrast to this Messiah who was born under his watch. Now we're going to find out that I have also put in there a slide about the provinces of the Roman Empire, but what I'm trying to show you with that slide is the vast territory that the Roman Empire included. I mean, that's as far north and far west as Great Britain and Spain, all the way over into the Middle East, or West Asia. Now, it's really important to realize that the furthest west the Roman Empire was Spain. Literally in the first century, they believed, people in the Roman Empire, believed that was the end of the world, Spain. So when you think about where the United States fits into the Bible, I'm going to argue it doesn't. People did not believe existed. Now, we could ask the Native Americans, but according to the Bible writers, the United States doesn't fall into there. That was undiscovered territory. Now, something really critical that we need to address today is something called the patron-client relationship, or the patron status relationship. Now, in the United States, we are really good at having social safety nets. What I mean by that is, and probably every one of us in the class have been some kind of product or a recipient of a social safety net. And for me, that could be when my father was disabled. There was disability benefits. Or when my wife had our children, she received WIC, which is a program for young mothers. There is welfare, there's Social Security, there's Medicaid, there's workers' comp, all these type of programs that we have. And unemployment insurance, you name it. The United States has really been trying to think about how do we help the most vulnerable of our society, the sick, the needy, you name it. But in first century Rome, there isn't any kind of notion of a social safety net. So how do you protect the poorest and the most needy in your society? Well, some of that is just dealt with. If you have a bad year of crops, you might just end up dying. Or if you get too sick, you're probably going to die. But for a lot of people, they were brought into a relationship with a wealthy family or a wealthy person. And this is how people in the first century gained clout or political power. So if I were wealthy, I may invite your family into a relationship with me, where I would maybe give you money for crops or for education, and you would pledge or put for me your undying loyalty. And just as in the Roman family, the father or the patron of the family was the most powerful person, this wealthy person, this patron who would give you their influence, their power. So if you got in trouble, they may go to court for you, or they would use their influence. It's kind of like having a friend in a high place, with the exception that this friend then asks you to be absolutely loyal for them. Oftentimes, this was a way for a wealthy person to gain a lot of clout so they can make a political move. Maybe they want to become a senator, or they want to challenge the throne. And we're going to find out that oftentimes these poor persons would gain and put their loyalty because this is the way they survived. So what we're going to find out, this is something I really want you to remember, is that loyalty is the chief virtue of the Roman Empire. You have to be a person of your word. Now, I would argue that in America, loyalty is not our chief virtue. I mean, you think about it. We have politicians who lie to us all the time. We have college football coaches who will do a press conference and say, man, I love being at this school. I can't imagine being anywhere else. I'm going to raise my kids here. It's wonderful and great. And what we're going to find out is 2 hours earlier, he was talking to the next school he's going to work at and working out the details. I mean, think about it. 50% of all marriages in the United States are going to fail. So people make a commitment at the altar, and then shortly afterwards, they, for whatever reason, end that commitment. Loyalty is not the chief virtue of America. Probably individual choice and freedom. Those are probably our chief virtues in the United States. But in the Roman Empire, loyalty. Think about how that works when you think about how do I want to say this? How the culture of the day can impact even the way you talk about God. So, if loyalty is the chief virtue for the Roman Empire, we think about the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Right? So we have in this prayer that the Father in heaven is the great patron. He's the one who provides bread. He's the one who provides justice. He's the one that brings us all together. And what does God ask? God asks of humanity absolute, complete loyalty. Another way to say this is faith. We're going to find out for half of the Bible, or half of the New Testament, when it's written by a guy by the name of Paul, St. Paul's works are going to center around the notion of faith, trusting in God, confessing with your lips that Jesus is Lord, and living that out. Not shrinking away or turning back from what Jesus asks you, but being totally, completely loyal. And this makes total sense in the Roman culture. They go, yeah, it's loyalty. So the patron-client status helps us understand that loyalty kept these groups together. This was a way to provide for the poor, but it was also a way for people to gain political status and clout. This is also the precursor, or the start to, the mafia. Because once a family gained so much power, maybe they have everyone else in your holler loyal to them, but you're holding out. They then may come to you and say, turns out it's going to be a wonderful year of crops for all the people in the holler. But I think for you, it may not be so wonderful. And you say, oh, no, it's going to be a great year. I've been working hard. And this family says, I think it's going to be a terrible year for you. What you begin to learn is it's the shakedown. They're going to do something to your crops unless you provide loyalty to them. So this patron-client relationship affected all of the empire. And we even see this today, how the really extremely wealthy can buy power, prestige. I mean, look at the presidential election. We have a billionaire running for president who's self-financing, gaining all this loyalty. It's the same thing. Now, what we're going to find out is another thing about the Roman Empire, and this is really one of the questionable things within the New Testament, is the discussion of slavery. Now, unfortunately, the United States is one of the worst examples of a nation being built on slavery. We know that the early wealth of the United States came from the backs of slaves, of African slaves, and also the blood of Native Americans. Right? White Europeans came in, colonized the nation, killed the Native Americans, shipped in African slaves, worked them to death, replaced them with other African slaves, and perpetuated an institution of slavery for over 250 years. So when we think about slavery, we automatically think about this hard chattel slavery that was going on in America. Slavery is never ever good. But it's very important to understand slavery in the Roman Empire was a little different. Number one, usually slavery happened because of poverty. We see this in America today. There's a lot of broke people, and they stay broke because of high interest rates. So for example, you have a medical crisis, you put some medical bills on a credit card, that credit card has 24 or 25% interest rate. You never get out from under that debt. So some people sold themselves into slavery, and they were never able to get out. Also, unlike America, where slaves were typically house slaves or field slaves, pick cotton, you name it. In the Roman Empire, slaves could do anything. Slaves could be doctors and teachers, all kinds of stuff. So, all areas of Roman life, they were slaves. A better way to think about it would be kind of the impact of minimum wage workers today. Minimum wage workers are at McDonald's, Walmart, Speedway, all areas that affect our lives. And almost everybody had a household slave. It was not uncommon, and it didn't even really show that you had super wealth if you had a household slave. Slavery came from poverty, but it came from conquest. So if the Roman Empire came in, took over this region, they may possibly enslave your men, right? So slavery could also be generational, and slaves were sold publicly, they were seen as an investment, and of course they were property. This is the danger of slavery, right? When you dehumanize somebody and you treat them as an object of property. And violence, sexual violence, was a norm in slavery, both in the United States and the Roman Empire. Some people only had sex slaves, so kind of like human trafficking today. But unlike America, in the 1700s, if I were living in Virginia and I was a wealthy plantation owner, I may go out and thrash one of my field slaves who I think is being disloyal or whatever. I may go out there and give him a whipping. And then I would go to the country club and I may brag about how I whipped my slave, and everyone would say, oh, keep them in line, blah, blah, blah. But in Rome, violence towards a slave wasn't something to brag about and wasn't popular. You didn't talk about that stuff. But also, here's something that's really critical. You never, ever showed kindness towards a slave. If you showed any kindness within the Roman Empire, they thought maybe, you must be kind of weak. You must be kind of a sissy, right? So think about that. That's the cultural expectation. There are slaves all around. 1/4 of the empire are slaves. And slaves are property. And showing kindness to a slave is profound, utter weakness. Then think about this. In the New Testament, there's a letter called Philippians. It's written by St. Paul. It's about halfway through the New Testament. It's four chapters. A couple profound things in there. But in the letter to the Philippians, Paul makes a claim. He recites this poem. And he says that Jesus, he's trying to explain who Jesus is. And he says Jesus is one who was equal with God. But Jesus did not counter or consider this equality with God as something to hold on to, as something to grasp a hold of. Jesus actually let that go. And Jesus, when he let that go, he became a human. So this downward mobility from God to human. And in this, Jesus not only took on the form of a human, but he became a slave. And when he became a slave, he endured death by a cross. So you have the highest high of being God, or being equal with God, and then being brought down here to death on the cross. But Paul's claim is that at the end of this downward mobility, God exalts Jesus. God exalts Jesus to the highest place, where his name is above every name. And Paul says at the end of Philippians 2, verse 11, that every tongue and every knee will bow, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Another way to say it is Jesus Christ is the Caesar. Jesus Christ is the emperor. So I say all that to say this. In this moment, what we find out is that Paul's argument is that the God of Christianity becomes weak. God shows kindness to the slave because God becomes a slave. That would be utterly foolish to the Roman Empire. And we're going to find out that throughout the New Testament, there are these political commentaries or countercultural claims, and this is a huge one that we kind of miss if we don't understand how the Roman Empire understood slavery. Also, you're going to see in here a couple images of the Roman Empire. The first one is the eagle. That was their image. Matches ours today in the United States. Now, the Pax Romana we have a slide about that, and that talks about the peace of Rome. This Roman peace, this golden age of Roman peace, which was started in 27 BCE, and it really goes all the way after the New Testament time to about 180 CE. This golden age of peace was ushered in by Octavian, this young emperor who defeats Mark Antony. Octavian or Augustus, he's the one who's claimed to be the Prince of Peace. He ushers in this golden age. Now, there were minor skirmishes, like there was the Jewish rebellion and all that. But for a huge empire like we saw, or we've seen on the slides, these are minor conflicts. So overall, in this 100 years or so of a golden age, this gives the perfect footing, the perfect foundation for a religion, a philosophy, a teaching to be able to flourish. And we're going to find out that with the incredible infrastructure, the roads that the Romans built, 50,000 miles of 50,000 miles of roads that the Romans built, the running water, the prosperity, the common language of Greek, in addition to this time of peace, all of that, you put that all in a jar and you shake it up, it becomes the perfect formula for something to go viral. So when Jesus' teachings are taken from Israel and they're taken to other places around the world, they have that ability to go across the world because of this time of peace. So there was leadership stability, People believed that this was the golden age. They believed this was the model for all political rule, and they gave perpetual thanks to Augustus or Octavian because he was the Prince of Peace. And that's going to become an important label for Jesus, because Jesus is going to claim this about himself, or his followers at least will claim this about him. This will be a title for him, and it's going to rival, because Jesus doesn't need to enact violence to bring peace. He doesn't need to enact threat. He doesn't need to use force or the threat of domination to bring peace, but the Roman Empire does. Now, we're going to find out that in the Roman Empire, that 2.2 million miles of territory, 1/4 of the world's population, fell under Roman domination. And the interesting thing about the Roman world was the key that held it all together was not only the rules or the laws of the Roman Empire, but it was that profound taxation that happened around the world. And we're going to find out most of the conflicts that happen within the empire deal with taxation. So I've given you a slide here that shows you a first century Roman soldier. You'll see the headpiece and the breastplate and the shoes and the staff and the shield, all that. We're going to find out that's an image that later in the New Testament, one of the writers, Paul, he's going to borrow, and he's actually going to say, hey, rather than having this like physical armor, you should put on the armor of God, the shield of faith, and all this kind of stuff. Now, the interesting thing about these Roman soldiers is they didn't have to act violently, right? But their simple presence in communities caused fear. I mean, think about it at UPike. If, when you came into class every day, we had 2 police officers standing outside the door, that would totally blow your mind. Now, it would become normal if it happened every day, but at first you'd be quite intimidated. Now, let's think about it again. Imagine if walking into class at the entrance were 2 men dressed in camouflage with machine guns, and they were my bodyguards. I don't think any of you would fall asleep in class, and I don't think any of you would talk back, because that would be so threatening. So Rome was a master at keeping people in line by just the inherent sense of threat. You learned it from a young child on. You don't mess with Rome. Now, about the army. They were professionally trained. Most armies were not. They were called up if necessary. But Rome had a professionally paid, trained army. And that means that they knew how to fight. And they knew how to fight disciplined. They knew how to fight well. Each soldier carried up to 60 pounds on his back. So think about marching from Rome in Europe to the Middle East or West Asia to Israel with 60 pounds on your back. The interesting thing is, there's a story in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, if they force you to go 1 mile, you should go 2. And what Jesus was talking about was, if a Roman soldier came to you, and maybe because there's such animosity and hatred between the Jews and the Romans hated being stationed in Israel. They didn't like the Jews. They thought the Jews were weird. All this kind of stuff. The Roman soldier may come up to you, maybe and they're marching along, and he may seek to totally embarrass you, right? So slap you a little bit and force you to carry his bag for 1 mile. Now think about it. If you were just kind of hoeing your crops, and you were forced then in front of your family to carry this soldier's bag for 1 mile, and then you had to walk back by yourself, that would bring such embarrassment, shame, and anger. And that's what the Romans wanted. They wanted to get you mad. They hoped for you to kind of snap on them and try to fight them so they could take out their anger and rage, because they didn't want to be in Israel. They didn't want to deal with these Jews. But Jesus' statement, if they force you to go 1 mile, you should go 2. Well, it turns out Roman law protected people in the empire, that the Roman soldiers could not force you to go more than 1 mile carrying their stuff. So Jesus is saying, keep the bag with you. It's a way of civil disobedience. And not to mention that, but if you're carrying the bag and you say, oh, isn't this great? Let's keep going. And the soldier's like, oh, no, like, give me my stuff back. And you're like, oh, no, come on, this is great. Keep on going. We find out that this sense of kindness, this sense of doing more than is expected, completely changes the dynamic. I mean, think about it. If you've ever been in a fight, right? People egg you on. They want to get you mad. They want you to get beyond thinking logically. They want you to fist fight them. And if you met their anger and you said, man, I love you, I want to pray for you, that would totally change the dynamic of the conflict. So this carrying the bag 2 miles changes the entire sense of threat, or it takes all the energy and all the steam out of their force. Also within the Roman Empire, or the army, there are different hierarchies of soldiers, right? We know that we have today generals and colonels and admirals and all this kind of stuff. Well, a key position in the Roman army is a centurion. This is not a person who lives to be 100, different word. A centurion is a person who was a military commander. He rode on horseback, he carried a staff, and it was a lifelong position. So once you got it, you stayed in that office until you died. It was very, very valuable. And this position was held in high regard, not only in the army of the Roman soldiers, but in all of the community. So this is kind of like being a 2-star general. If you're a 2-star general, you walk in anywhere, people are going to salute you and you're going to get your props. Well, we're going to find out in the Bible there are multiple centurions that Jesus and his followers deal with, and one of the profoundly interesting things is, why is this person who is, what's the word I'm looking for, has such privilege in the community, why are they going to this peasant Jewish person for help? This would be like Barack Obama calling me, or President Obama calling me for advice. It wouldn't make any sense, right? President Obama has many great advisors. I don't think he really needs me. So we're going to find out how also vulnerable it makes these centurions. They're putting their position on the line when they connect with this rival teaching. Also in the Roman army, the poor could volunteer and fight. And if you fought for the Roman army for 30 years, you were given property and citizenship. Now, very few actually survived because of the death rates and all of that, but it was a great chance for social mobility. If you grew up in a very poor family and come from very poor people, joining the military would be your chance for social mobility. Now, what we're going to find out is that the cool thing, I think, about this lecture is talking about the various religious experiences